Well, good afternoon. My name is Keith Willoughby. I am the Dean of the greatest business school in Canada. Thank you. So Keith Willoughby, preferred pronouns he and him. I am the Dean of the Edwards School of Business, University of Saskatchewan. As we gather here today for the 19th time with the Haddock Entrepreneurial Speaker Series, we acknowledge that we are meeting today on Treaty 6 territory and traditional homeland of the Métis. As a non-Indigenous business leader, as a non-Indigenous Dean, I pay sincere respect to First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place, to the original caretakers of the territory, and I'm grateful for people who cherish the land. As a settler with ancestors from the Ukraine and from Norway and the British Isles, I am grateful for the land and its preservation. And as a leader, I commit to listening and learning from traditional knowledge keepers and elders so we can commit to reconciliation truthfully as a society. I warmly welcome you today. I know it's like minus 20-something outside, but that might be the warmest temperature ever for a Haddock event. This is the 19th annual Gordon and Maureen Haddock Entrepreneurial Speaker Series, an amazing annual event. We also today are welcoming individuals who are participating in the Get a Bigger Wagon event. And thank you, family members, for being with us today. I'm wearing a bracelet that is probably one of the coolest things I've ever received as a dean. The swag that I've got as a dean from an entrepreneur many, many years ago. Entrepreneurs find solutions to challenges. They find solutions to problems. They turn challenges into opportunities. They recognize circumstances. They make plans. They take action. That, to me, represents the nearly 2-decade history of the Gordon and Maureen Haddock Entrepreneurial Speaker Series event. Allow me to introduce for a few minutes Gordon and Maureen Haddock. They are friends, great friends of the Edwards School of Business. They're both alumni of the University of Saskatchewan. Gordon graduated with a Bachelor of Commerce degree. Maureen is a graduate of the College of Education. In 2007, their vision, their dedication, their commitment launched this event that we're celebrating today, the Haddock Entrepreneurial Speaker Series. It has assembled a living legacy of previous speakers who have spoken and addressed their accomplishments, their successes, their setbacks, and their achievements. Also today we have Get a Bigger Wagon, which is a tremendous representation of young entrepreneurship in action. Cold weather has never postponed the Haddock event. COVID might have canceled the 2020 Junos. COVID might have canceled an entire Canadian Football League season in 2020. Remember, Gordon, Maureen, COVID, we went ahead with a Haddock event during the pandemic. Gordon and Maureen, thank you. Your legacy is as inspirational as it is aspirational. Thank you for being friends of this college, for being leaders of entrepreneurial thought and action, and for enabling us to be in this good spot today. Allow me to invite to the stand Gord Haddock, who will come forward to introduce today's special guest speaker, Monique Simair. Gord, to you.
We'll just do a little mic test, I guess. Can everybody hear? That's good. And Keith, you're stealing my lines about the weather. Yeah, it was minus 12 when we drove up here. That is the warmest it has ever been. Second place would be minus 25. Worst was minus 40. So I appreciate everybody coming out, but it was easy this year compared to other years. I would ask one thing, just as a technical thing, if you got your phones, do you want to turn your phones off, everybody? I know your commerce students are going to be getting a call from your brokers or something, but maybe just turn them off. Now, business takes many, many forms, and if you followed our speaker series over the past 18 years, you would have heard from entrepreneurs on everything from modular homes, land development, home construction, farm equipment, to an industrial manufacturing business. The one area we have never featured is science and business. And that is about to change today, as our guest speaker started her first business to create jobs for scientists like herself by commercializing research into impactful technologies and services. Dr. Simair is a PhD biogeochemist. Now, that's the first time I've ever introduced someone is a biogeochemist, who founded and sold 2 environmental tech companies whose work has helped shift mining and resource development toward more sustainable practices across Canada. Monique was named one of Canada's future entrepreneurial leaders by Profit magazine in 2011 and added to its W100 list of Canada's top female entrepreneurs in 2015. In addition, she was named the 2021 Eco Impact winner by Eco Canada, and this is a really important thing, was the youngest member appointed to Canada's Science, Technology, and Innovation Council. That's quite a statement. And if she had any spare time left, she also served as an adjunct professor at the U of S and Clemson University, as well as pursuing her interests in cooking, baking, gardening, and growing orchids. Now, anybody who knows anything about flowers, which I do not, but I do know growing orchids is hard. And I know baking is a lot of science in baking, because my good wife, Maureen, writes 2 columns for magazines about baking, and she's talking about chemical reactions between vinegar and something else. And really, I just want to get to the product. I don't care how we got there. But so where does this creative energy and passion come from? Well, you might be interested to know that entrepreneurship and creativity run deep in the Simair family. Monique's parents, who happen to be sitting over there quietly trying to be inconspicuous, are internationally acclaimed crystalline ceramic artists, and their stunning works of art are found in collections all around the world. And her brothers were also founding members of Skip the Dishes. You might have heard of that, as well as other companies. Now, this family must have had some very interesting supper time discussions. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall at your dinner table, because I can imagine where it went each night. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Monique Simair.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that introduction. I appreciate it. Thank you so much to the Haddocks for sponsoring this event and having everyone out here, the Edwards School of Business for hosting and inviting me to speak, and of course to everybody who's come out here today on this not so cold January. And I hear there's a few people online too, so thank you for that. Gord actually stole my bit about pointing out my parents. I was going to also say thank you to them for coming out, because it's actually the first time they've gotten to see me speak in person since I defended my thesis on campus 17 years ago, 2009. So that's it's really special to be able to do that.
Keith stole my line about the weather.
I'm in good company then. I didn't set out to be an entrepreneur. I had trained as a scientist, and I assumed that if I followed all the right steps, there would be a clear next step at the end of it. But like so many hypotheses that I'd made through my life, I managed to prove myself wrong about that. I did a PhD, 3 postdocs in different fields, and I had over 12 first author publications for my PhD alone. By the time I was 28 years old, I found myself unemployed, in a job market with very few options, and alongside so many other scientists in the same boat. I ended up starting my first company to create jobs for other scientists like myself. Okay, honestly, I created it so I could have a job, myself, but also for others. In retrospect, I'm not surprised about how unpredictable those 15 years of founding, growing, and selling 2 businesses in the mining and environment sector ended up being. In fact, if I had known what that roadmap would look like, I don't know if I would have actually taken those first steps. But it was so good, I did it twice. What I do find really interesting to think about, though, is what got me through those 15 years. It wasn't scientific certainty. It wasn't perfect data or even some type of an entrepreneurial playbook or checklist that I followed. It was 3 things that kept showing up again and again: curiosity, grit, and hope. And they kept showing up in both practical and unexpected ways. I can't fit 15 years in 35 minutes here today. Believe me, I tried. And if you know me, you know I can talk a lot. So thankfully, a few friends set me on the right path and said, no, you got to narrow that down, otherwise we'll be here for days. So thinking of all the young entrepreneurs that are in the room, the students and those here with the Get a Bigger Wagon, I thought, what lessons could I try to convey? So I've picked 4 special moments. These are moments that changed how I think and how I make decisions to this day. These are not the highlights reel. In fact, some of them are real lowlights. But that's sometimes where we learn the most from. These aren't things that you're going to see in the headlines of a news story. You're probably never going to hear about them in a classroom. And you sure aren't going to find them in a popular entrepreneurship book. Unless maybe I someday get around to writing. We'll see. Deciding where to start this talk was a bit tough for me. As Gord mentioned, I come from an entrepreneurial family. I could have started out by talking about the summers of growing and selling garden produce with my family and how that shaped my early experiences, or selling pottery with my parents at craft shows before they made their break and got really, really great at it. I also could start this talk about being in the first ever pitch party that the Edwards School of Business ever held back in 2009. But spoiler alert, my brothers, the ones that did skip the dishes, my 2 little brothers and I, we did it and we got very last place. You can start out anywhere. For the sake of this talk, I'm going to start out with a very key moment that I think was pivotal in me launching my first business. I was over in Innovation Place, sitting in my car, bawling my eyes out. I had just gotten fired from my first ever job as a scientist. Yeah, people get fired. It happens more often than you think. I was let go without cause a year into my first job. And I remember sitting there thinking, why on earth had I worked so hard? I'd given it my all. I'd even been reprimanded for working too much unpaid overtime. I guess I kind of just always had that entrepreneurial spirit. Something interesting started happening in those days after, though. As I was sitting at home, thinking about what I was going to do with my life, contemplating if I even wanted to be a scientist anymore, some of my old clients started to call. They asked me how I was doing, what I was going to do next. But one in particular, and this was a company that was a Saskatchewan company, still operated by its founders. And they said, we want you to do our project. And I said, that's very nice of you, but I can't. I'm no longer there. I don't have a lab. And they said, yeah, we get that, but we think you should do our project. It happened to be on a topic that was related to one of the postdocs I had done in biofuels. And it wasn't just any project. It was $500,000 over 2 years. Now, any entrepreneur would think, wow, that is amazing. How do you launch your company with a $500,000 contract? Like, how do I get to do that? That's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I wasn't an entrepreneur yet. In my mind, and I'm pretty sure I didn't say this out loud to them, but I might have, is you're crazy. Nobody goes and opens a lab. You just don't do that. Do you have any idea of how hard that is and how expensive it is and all these things? I didn't know what it meant to run a business. I didn't even know what a business plan. And to be very honest, neither of my businesses had a business plan. Maybe somewhere in the back of my mind, but never formally written up. But I've always been the type of person that if you tell me I can't do something, That makes me want to do it 10 times more. And here I was, sitting there, telling myself I couldn't do something. And that made me pause and think, why did I think I couldn't do this? I put on my science hat then, started looking at this like an experiment. Okay, if I thought something wasn't possible in science, I could prove or disprove that. I could think through this. And the more I started to question this and question myself, the more I realized, wait a second, maybe I could. I didn't know how to run a business, but I did know how to run a project. I knew how to run a budget for a project and all these different things that I learned through my PhD. And I started to think maybe this is possible. But at the same time, I'd been interviewing for jobs, and I got a job offer. It paid more than 50% more than I was making at that last job. It was a sure thing. It would be a nice, predictable, known path forward. I'd have security. I also knew I might be a little bit bored in that job, kind of like the last one. And so it wasn't about, was this a good idea or not? It was about, was I going to take the safe, sure thing? Or was I going to go and do something that I'd never even heard of being done before? I didn't even have a roadmap. But I chose to take that first step. Another complicating factor was that this company was very open with me, that in order to even get that project with me, it was going to take a few months. So it's not like it was a sure thing. They had to go through some legal hurdles to cancel their other contract, pay fines and fees, go through the granting agencies and the government, get their board members on side, the government on side, and so many hurdles. But I thought, it's worth it. I'll give it a try, and if that doesn't all come through, I can always go find a job. So I launched Contango Strategies in 2010 with $30,000 that I was able to scrape together. A neat thing happened is once I created that, other clients started to call. They were little jobs, but they were out there. And the first 4 contracts I got were actually by other either startups or founder-run companies. And I think that's really cool because all these other entrepreneurial-minded people, they saw my little startup and they didn't think, oh, that's risky. Don't go give her a contract yet. Who knows what's going to happen? They saw opportunity. And that vision they had and that hope they had for what I was going to create, that became contagious. And I started to feel it too. Eventually, I did get that contract. And there was a shifting point for me because I was seeing this 2-year, $500,000 project as a project. In my mind, it was still like, well, that'll give me 2 years to figure out what I was going to do next. I hadn't really thought of it that this was going to be a company until other people started calling and giving me contracts. But when I got that big contract, a few of my other past colleagues, they actually quit their jobs and joined me. Now it wasn't me with a contract trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life. It was a business. I had a team, and I was accountable to them also to make sure that they had jobs going forward. What I started to realize is as those calls came in and as those past colleagues joined up, all that work I had done in that year at that job, it wasn't for them. It wasn't for the company. The things that you do when you don't think anyone's watching, the way you work, the way you make your decisions, the corners that you cut, or maybe the corners you don't cut, all those end up forming your reputation. And your reputation goes with you everywhere you go. You don't get to decide when your reputation shows up and comes to your rescue, or when it's to your detriment, but it does. And you get to decide how your reputation is getting built along the way. From that point forward, it really changed my viewpoint on how hard I worked and my grit and my resolve, because I realized it wasn't for some external out there. It was for me, my team, and my people. What I didn't realize at the time, though, was that not having a roadmap, because I had no roadmap for this, that can actually be an advantage. There was infinite possibilities. If there had been examples out there that I could follow, I would have started comparing myself to them, and I would have judged myself. I would have thought I have to do it like them, or I'm not doing as good as those others. I would have optimized for similarity instead of for what I thought was the best or the most opportune. You could think about it a bit like having a blank canvas where you can do anything you want, or a paint by numbers. They're both good, they're both fun and fair, but one gives you way more opportunity. The challenge is, when you have that sort of freedom and you don't have clarity, it can turn into noise very quickly. And I had to figure out where I was going. Like a lot of people, I started a company with a single thing. In my case, it was a project. For some people, it's a product or a technology. But none of those things alone is a company. I knew I had to grow the company, but I didn't know what that meant or how to do it. I had never taken a business class even. But I thought, well, if you need to grow something, I know how to grow things. I can grow plants and stuff like that, my orchids. But I also know how to grow organisms. I was a microbiologist. So I thought, well, if I need to grow something, I needed to be healthy, I needed to be fed, I needed to have all these things. But I didn't even know what type of organism my company was. Well, I thought maybe I could figure that out by knowing my clients. I knew I wanted to get into the mining and environment sector. I'd done a postdoc in that area. Back before biogeochemistry was even called that. I was that weirdo microbiologist who they asked to go look at some rocks. In fact, they said, would you come and look at these tailings and see if there's microbes? And I said, what's tailings? And they had to explain to me that it's like the sand that comes off of the mine at the end that no longer has the valuable minerals. And even though I'd done a postdoc in it, I thought, do I really understand my clients and what they would need? There's this thing in sales called, are you pushing a product or selling a solution? And I see this happening so often, where people have a product and they go around looking for a problem for it to solve. And it's so backwards. So I put on my curious scientist mind again and said, how could I better understand my clients? In those early days, I should actually just mention here, so in my postdoc with mining, one of the things I'd noticed in that area is not only there's a lot of opportunity in mining in terms of a place that I could get into for business, but it also was a place where there was a lot of academic research that could easily be a sellable technology. Because I'd come from a background in medical microbiology, immunology, and food sciences. And what that let me do is think, well, if they're already doing this as commercial fee-for-service in medicine, why on earth is mining doing it as a 4-year postdoc? So I knew there's low-hanging fruit there that I could transfer, but did the mines need it? In those first years, when I started getting mining contracts, just small little things, instead of sending my team members out to the mines, I personally went. I spent, in those first years, I was doing more than 100 flights a year and living in mine camps through most of the year. All across Canada, I spent 5 years in and out of Kyrgyzstan in mine camps, getting to know the operations in and out. And actually that travel is something that I loved and never thought I'd be doing as a microbiologist. As I got to know that industry, I realized that if I thought of my company as an organism, I could think of that sector as an ecosystem. Not just a business ecosystem, I didn't know that term. I was thinking of a biological ecosystem, where in this case, well, in a biological ecosystem, you have maybe the food and the predators and all those different things. Well, maybe not predators in this case, but we had the mines, we had the regulators, we had the community members, we had government, and we had other consultants. They all needed to be working together in order for that to be a healthy ecosystem. And sometimes they were at odds with each other. By embedding myself into those mines, I got to understand how they worked, what their actual pain points were. And we hear a lot in sales and in business that, you have to solve a pain. The thing is, not everybody wants their pain to be solved. It can actually be really painful to solve a pain, or it's connected to too many other things you can't change. So I got to understand the things they actually could change or wanted to, or what would have the biggest impact. I also made a lot of friends. Leading with curiosity, going in there, I was able to get to know people. Rather than going in and telling them what I could do or telling them what science could do, leading with curiosity and seeking to understand. That actually outperformed every sales tactic I've ever seen out there. Lead with curiosity. If you can understand and solve a problem, it'll beat selling every day. And in retrospect, what I learned afterwards was that I wasn't just solving problems for them. When you can solve a pain that someone's had for a long time, or when somebody has an aspiration they've held on to but not quite been able to do yet, when you come in and help them with that, you're actually giving them hope. And once again, I learned hope is contagious. And that is a powerful sales tool. We say in sales and mostly in tech, I would say, that shipping beats perfection. Any of the students heard that yet, if you work in tech? Shipping beats perfection. It means it's better to send out something and to sell something very small, your minimum viable product, get that out and then get feedback on it. Because if you wait and try to make every aspect perfect, you might have been optimizing for the wrong thing. You're trying to make it the perfect color of purple, and instead they don't care about color, unfortunately. So get it out fast. But who do you get feedback from? Who do you get honest, real feedback from? Well, it turns out all of those friends I had made. They were so excited to give feedback. They were excited to tell me about the next thing and what we could do. And that made our technologies so much better. Developing the technologies was hard. I'm not going to get into that here because that could be a whole seminar and class and probably semester on its own. I spent many nights sleeping under my desk in the lab. My first lab was actually a storage room in Innovation Place. It wasn't until a couple years later we even got a window. I had to make that $500,000 go far, believe me. But here's what I learned. One of our first technologies was something called metagenomics. And what that is taking the DNA from a sample, and based on the DNA, we could tell every different bacteria that was in that sample. That's done in human health quite a bit. We were the first ever to do that for the environment, whether it was slime or tailings or dirt or water. And by knowing what bacteria were there, we could tell you what they could do to remediate or clean the site. The thing is, it turns out, most mines do not care what bacteria are in their sample. Not at all. But they do care about water treatment, and those microbes matter in water treatment. Specifically, they cared about treating selenium. And the number one way to treat selenium is biological. We end up doing hundreds of thousands of dollars a year of metagenomics testing for selenium treatment bioreactors. The second one was treatment wetlands, where we could actually treat any type of water from the mines. I shouldn't say any type. Most types of water from the mines we could treat, like tailings, we could treat it by using a wetland. The thing is, by understanding the ecosystem of the sector, I found that the mines didn't actually care about that as a water treatment system. They cared about it as a regulatory solution. And they would spend millions of dollars on research and development in order to do a 20-year program for their closure plan. And third, I learned that there was more places I could sell to than just the mines. It turns out half of our revenues ended up coming from other consulting firms. You might have thought they'd be our competitors, but no, they were our best clients, and they would introduce us to mines. Because with that curiosity, I was able to approach them in a way that we learned we weren't competing. We could work together. We had a little bit of overlap, but we could play nice. And that leads me into the next part. Over the years, Contango was doing really well. We'd grown to about 25 people. We had built something really great, unique, and we were the first to market on those two key technologies. Many mines wanted it. And when that happens, word of mouth spreads. And so companies started to approach us for acquisition. This is usually the part of the story that's framed as the finish line and the big hype part. I should quickly mention, I didn't have a business plan. I also did not have an exit plan. So I hadn't thought of this. I didn't know what came next. Eventually, I did choose to sell. But I promise you, this is not a highlight reel. Yes, it made headlines. Yes, there was news stories about it. And, on paper, it was a success. I made money. They continue to make money off of it. The business continues on. But no one talks about this other part. You often hear that founders don't stay on with the acquiring company, but very few people talk about why. We just assume it's because founders are so creative, or, oh, that was their baby and they cared too much about it, and all these different things. I don't think many of those people telling those stories have actually talked to the entrepreneurs. I've talked to so many entrepreneurs who have sold their businesses, and every single one have gone through this. This doesn't just apply to entrepreneurs, okay? I'm going to preface this. If you ever plan on retiring, this applies to you. If you're a student and you expect you're going to finish your exams this year, it might apply to you. This also happens to actors when they finish doing a play or a series on TV, and it can even happen to athletes when they finish their regular season or their playoffs. It's called a dopamine crash. Neurobiochemistry, who would have thought that plays into business again? So you are going, you got all this energy, you got this momentum, and then boom, it's done. And you're no longer getting that dopamine, and you don't know what you're going to do next. You've lost your vision, you've lost your goal. And clinically speaking, if they were to measure your dopamine, you're operating at a normal level for a normal human. But physically, it feels like depression. And it is a hard thing to go through because you no longer have that vision, which gives you hope. So when you don't have hope out there, what are you working towards? What's your grit anymore? And eventually I did come through that. But I had to learn that sometimes in those moments when it feels dark and you don't have hope for your own future, you don't know what's next for you, you can get that by helping others find theirs or by cheering for others who are pursuing theirs, and that'll help you out. So even though that didn't maybe personally feel like a win, it was, and it took me several years before I could actually look back and realize, oh wait, that was pretty good. It took a few friends sitting me down to say, look, Monique, you do realize the way we see it. And that really helped. And a few months ago, I actually had supper with my old boss. And he said, you know, we actually still use all your old processes. We brought them into our bigger company. It was a publicly traded company, and they brought some of our processes in. They still run what they call the metagenomics assays for the mines and still do all those things. But one of the things that had changed when I was there is I had joined their company expecting to build a pilot facility and a research center and develop more technology. Being a publicly traded company, they had to evaluate all their needs and their growth goals all the time, and they decided that wasn't where they were going when I was there. And so I started to think, just because I had to give up on those dreams while I was there, didn't mean I still couldn't pursue that. So I started to gather hope again, get a little bit curious, and think about how I might be able to do this. And eventually, I did launch Maven. I'm going to fast forward through many years here. And I'm going to give you a quick heads up. I'm going to talk about a couple of actually personally health challenging things I went through at Maven. I want you to know that before I talk about that stuff, I'm good now. I'm healthy, I'm through the other side, I'm very happy, and life is great. Okay? So keep in mind that when you hear about this. I'm going to fast forward through COVID. So 2019, I founded Maven. 2020, COVID hit. Between 2019 and 2020, I actually had a non-compete, so we couldn't take on any clients. COVID lockdown happened the week that our non-compete ended. We had to get through one more year without revenue. And in the meantime, I had built the first ever pilot and research facility independently for this type of work. And it was sitting there empty in Stonebridge. We had people in it. I continued to make sure I had our people there, and you know, the things that happened through COVID, I learned so much through that. But COVID was a very complicated time, and I hope it never happens again. So I'm going to skip the COVID era, other than to give some context that I had a senior management team lined up before then across Canada that were going to help me, because I really wanted to be in a team this time. I wanted a whole management team to do this together in co-ownership. And that hadn't happened yet. I was still working on it. 4 years into Maven, our pilot facilities are operating great. So I fast forwarded now into 2023, okay? The pilot facilities are operating great. Our technologies for water treatment are real. They've been piloted, proven at different places, and we're at this point where we're ready for detailed engineering and construction. We're in this growth and scale-up phase where when you're in a startup, see, by this time I knew a little bit about business. I'd done some reading, learned the language, and we were pursuing top-line revenue. So typically when you start up a company, you try to grow the revenue first, the sales, and later on you worry about being profitable, because you sink every penny you have back into growing that company, because you need to get to a certain revenue, certain quantity of people. It costs money to hire people and train them. So we were pursuing revenue. What most people don't realize is you can't pursue those two things very well at the same time. top line revenue and profitability, that's like saying, hey, I want to be an Ironman triathlete and I also want to win strongman competitions. They're both really tough. They're both admirable. But if you train for both, you're never going to excel at either. And you might also break yourself. So you have to know which one you're doing. I was doing top line revenue. Things were pretty good. And I thought maybe this was the chance that I could start a family. I'd always wanted to have a bunch of children. And unfortunately, a few months into my pregnancy, I had a very complicated miscarriage. In that next year, I'd have 4 surgeries, countless procedures, and I spent more time in doctors' offices than I'd ever want to remember. That made me reevaluate my goals. I could not continue to pursue top-line revenue growth. It wasn't possible with the constraints on me. Sometimes things happen outside of business, and I hope nobody has that happen to them. But the thing is, we will all have something happen to us that impacts our ability to deliver on the vision we had, whether it was COVID or a health crisis or some other things that happen. Hopefully it's something great, and you have good things happen that change it. But what I realized there was there's no way I could continue to push on that revenue growth. And my scientist brain helped me out here again, where I started thinking, well, I couldn't create what I wanted in that way, but maybe there's a different way. I had to start thinking back into first level principles and fundamentals. What were my original goals? Why was I pursuing top line revenue growth? And I realized the things that I really wanted was to make sure I had viable water treatment technologies, operating pilot facilities that would continue to fuel new technology development, and also to continue to create good, stable jobs for scientists and engineers here in Saskatoon. There was a lot of ways I could do that. And I realized with the level where our technologies were at, and my desire to be in a team, I could do this through a sale. And so in order to pursue a sale, I had to pursue profitability, not just top-line revenue growth. And so I talked to my team members, explained what was going on, and at this point, I'll also say, all of my clients in the mining sector knew what was going on too. I know you hear a lot about it being a male-dominated sector and all these things. Man, the support I got was just phenomenal. I was able to talk to all my clients. They rearranged their deadlines, helped out, shifted things around. Collaborators picked up some of the slack that we needed. It was so much support in that community. I can't say enough good about that outcome. And so talking to my team, I offered people overtime or bonus pay as they needed, whoever was willing and able to dive into this. And what we did was we stopped hiring. I didn't want to freak anybody out by stopping hiring, so I told them why we're doing this, because hiring people costs a lot of money and it's going to take 6 months to a year before we get any actual profit out of that person, their efforts. And in that year, we were able to turn things around. Instead of pursuing revenue growth, we stabilized revenue growth. Just held steady at the same revenues, no more growth, and we got a 40% profit margin out that year. We had 3 companies approach us to purchase, and ultimately I picked one that I thought was going to be most successful in getting those technologies out to market and to continue running that pilot facility. This experience reshaped my definition of grit. Sometimes we think of grit as doing the most of a task, and we have to think about what metrics we're actually measuring ourselves against. We often talk about leading and lagging indicators. I was pursuing those leading indicators too much. I was too married to the metrics that I thought I needed. And I was able to actually achieve the same end goals and the things that aligned with my values by shifting that focus. So what I realized was that grit isn't about doing more tasks. Sometimes grit is actually about having clarity to know your goals and then the strength to change and see through what matters. The sale of Maven closed in January 2025. The pilot facilities are still operating. I should also mention my first company is still operating in Saskatoon also over an innovation place under a different name. In contrast with my first sale, I was psychologically ready this time. I knew that a dopamine crash was going to happen. I had all this preparedness, and I had also started to think of multiple different options on how the future might look. When it eventually did come time to move on, I did so with a sense of peace. I knew that the systems worked, the physical laboratories were amazing, and the new technologies were all set up to succeed. I had peace for what I had just closed, but also a curiosity and a hope for what might be next. Because once again, I was now at this exciting place without a clear roadmap. But this time, it was different. I knew that what I want to do next is about building community and helping others in their journey in entrepreneurship and innovation. So if I zoom out across all this, there's three things that keep showing up: curiosity, grit, and hope. Curiosity is what opens things up. It pushes you to understand systems instead of copying templates or defaulting to what might be familiar. If you use curiosity well, it doesn't just expand what you see, but also can create shared ground between people who don't think alike, but are still willing to try to understand one another. Grit is what enables us to see things through. It's not necessarily about grinding out more tasks, as sometimes we might think of it, but it's about having the strength to follow through on what actually matters. It's the discipline to keep your effort aligned with your values and direction, even as those conditions may change. Together, curiosity and grit shape how you operate under uncertainty. But they don't fully explain why people choose that path in the first place. That's where hope comes in. Entrepreneurs are often described as risk takers or relentless optimists, people who just won't quit. I don't think that quite captures it. Entrepreneurs could choose certainty, simplicity, or safety. Instead, they choose to believe that their actions can make tomorrow better, not just for themselves, but for others. In that sense, I think entrepreneurs are actually some of the most hopeful people in our society. But somewhere along the way, we narrowed entrepreneurship to mean company formation, pitch decks, venture capital, and exit strategies. At its core, though, entrepreneurship is a mindset before it's a business model. It's the habit of seeing possibility where others see constraints. Choosing action even when guarantees aren't possible. When you frame it this way, entrepreneurship stops being about ambition and starts being about responsibility powered by hope. It's that responsibility for improving what's in front of you, even when the system doesn't make it easy and certainty isn't an available option. Businesses are one expression of that mindset, but they're not the only one, and they're not even the most important. That way of operating shows up inside of organizations, public institutions, communities, and especially shows up in moments of transition, anywhere that people are willing to act with certainty when they're guided by curiosity, hope, and grit. Thank you.
Thank you, Monique. That's when someone shares a personal journey, that is very special and not easy. And so we really appreciate that. Oh, pardon me. I'm just getting a call here. Yeah, it's from Sharon from the Dean's office. Apparently, the Dean has a special announcement. I guess we'll have to interrupt our regularly scheduled program for something. I don't know what's going on.
We've been delighted to hear a presentation today, a talk on curiosity, grit, and hope. Before we get into the question and answer session for today, I would like to, Monique, if you can join me up here. Some of you might know that the Edwards School of Business recently received a gift from Bernie Slogotsky and Theodore Hunt to launch the Slogotsky Hunt Center for Entrepreneurship. And today, as Dean of the Edwards School of Business, it gives me incredible joy, satisfaction, and happiness to officially announce that Monique Simair is the inaugural director of the Slogotsky Hunt Center for Entrepreneurship. I don't think I'm still double parked, so I'll go check.
Okay.
The Q&A now, is that?
Sorry? Yeah, we could, sure. Yeah. If you would have any questions, now would be the time before we get to the other part of our program, which is handing out cash.
Thank you. So just by way of protocol and procedure here, I'll open it up for the question and answer portion of the event where we can address our questions, our comments to Monique, an truly inspirational entrepreneur. Your message about curiosity, grit, and hope is fantastic. And of course, our announcement of you being the inaugural director adds a special significance to today's celebration. As a reminder, guests can ask the questions here in the room. There is a microphone in the center aisleway here. For those guests who are joining us virtually, you can ask a question in the live stream chat, which will then be relayed to myself to address to Monique. So go right ahead.
Congratulations, Monique, 3 times.
Thank you.
James Lear, alumni, Edwards School of Business. So my question for you is, in your new role, which I'm excited to hear about moments ago, in your new role, how are you going to talk about to people pursuing entrepreneurship or learning about entrepreneurship the challenges of getting the right team and the steps one needs to take to change a team member if needed?
Oh, that's a loaded question. Changing team members is really hard. So I'll first talk about finding the right team. I think we are in a very, I'll say I'm very lucky to be doing this in Saskatchewan, because Saskatchewan actually has one of the highest number of entrepreneurs per capita of anywhere in Canada. It might actually be the top when you start digging into the base numbers and statistics. So there's a lot of entrepreneurial-minded people in Saskatchewan, so you have a lot to draw from. I always tell people, if you don't have somebody with experience starting, there's a few different groups that I try to hire from, okay? Because they get this curiosity, grit, and hope thing. They're also not as scared to take risks because they don't see failure in the same way. So one is scientists. We've been trained to not view a failed experiment as a failure. It's just the next step in your journey and figuring out your science, okay? Another one is farm kids that have worked hands-on because they're used to getting in there and figuring out how to do something, okay? Another one's athletes. Athletes learn that you can lose a game, but you continue playing. In fact, you might train harder because of that. They're also very coachable. Another one is immigrants, because they have been willing to move around the world and try something brand new. So they're not as scared about newness as others. And so those are a few different places. There's many other places you can find great people that are good at startups and entrepreneurship. Those are some places you can start looking for. Switching out, so it's really about that. I think finding good hires for entrepreneurship is about the person more than about their background training or their skills. Switching people out. So I do mentorship with several startup types of community things, a lot with creative destruction labs. And that's something we advise people on quite a bit, where it might be the right founder, but then you have to flip out. And it's a very difficult discussion to have, but you have to think about what serves the business best. And I've personally chosen to bootstrap the companies I did rather than venture capital route. But typically when you have venture capital in, they're going to make that decision for you. There's no easy way to do it, but you have to think of the bigger picture typically and the health of the whole company or organism.
Thank you.
Hello, Monique. Brian McRae, also alum from Edwards, former speaker on the stage as well. Thanks for sharing today, and congratulations on your new role. You kind of alluded to it. We've talked about your family of entrepreneurs. I'm hoping you could share a little bit more about your upbringing and how on earth these 2 wonderful parents gave birth to 4 incredible entrepreneurs. And shed some light on some of those formative lessons and influences that your parents were on you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Brian. And I'd also like to point out Brian had met my youngest brother here in school originally through the Edwards School of Business, and then my other brothers through that. And so I've gotten to meet him a few times over the years too. It's this school pumps out some great entrepreneurs. I get asked that a lot about my family and my upbringing, and the funny thing is I then asked each one of my brothers, and we all have different answers. So I think that in itself says something, is that we were all raised to think critically and come up with our own thoughts and ideas rather than just to default to an answer somebody else had. There's a lot of highlights that you hear about, oh, all these entrepreneurs, and it must sound great, and my parents must be so proud, and I think they are. But what you have to recognize is they're also the ones that we all call with the major problems. They don't just hear the highlights reel, they hear the pain that happens all the time. And when I was growing my first business especially, because my brothers had skipped the dishes between 2012 they started it and 2016 is when they sold. And I knew on any given day when I was having a hard day, I could call one of them and hear something that was 100 times more painful than what I was going through. And I think that's part of keeping humor about it, and not just trying to show one another up, but raise one another up and talk about those hard things that you're dealing with. There's one thing that I do personally credit a lot to, which is growing up, every single person in my family is neurodivergent in some way by today's standards. And my dad's very open that he's dyslexic and also ADD. And so growing up, we did have bedtime stories and we did read a bit, but a lot of it was actually making up a story. And so we would make up stories at night instead of reading the same story again and again. And I think that creates something where you're willing to invent a story and think about what could be instead of hearing a story read to you all the time. So, yeah.
Hi, I'm Shravali. I'm a Bachelor of Commerce student in my marketing major. I have a two-parter, if that's okay. So the first thing I want to ask is, what's one thing you expected walking into both of your businesses that sort of like took an unexpected turn and didn't go entirely as planned?
I would say everything. The only sure thing I can say about starting a bit, and this goes for so many of my other friends who are entrepreneurs, I don't think they would disagree with me on this. I'm kind of looking at a few faces around here in the audience that I know, and the only sure thing is that things are not going to go as expected. And you have to be open to that and ready for that. And just being kind of willing to go with the flow, but also thinking, well, can this still work? How would I, don't give up on your goal when unexpected things happen, but you have to be flexible with it. There's, I mentioned very briefly in the talk that if I had actually seen, if somebody had written out for me what that first journey would be like, or even what the second one, if somebody said, this is what you're signing up for, I would have said, not a chance, no thank you. But it was such a beautiful journey to actually live through. And I'm glad I did. So, nothing's going to be as you expect if you start a business. That's the only sure thing.
Thank you. And then the other thing I wanted to ask is, I know I personally learn a lot from just extracurricular reading, not apart from coursework as well. What's 2 books you would recommend everyone read, regardless of what line they're in?
Okay, I read extensively, so much that my friends have actually told me I need to start posting about this online. I have a podcast starting in a week or two where I'll put some of this stuff out there called Outlier Mindset. So I read a lot, and I try to read books that I agree with, books I do not agree with, and all over the place. Something that really I found useful was a book by Nassim Taleb called Fooled by Randomness. It's fairly old, but really good. My PhD supervisor actually gave me a copy of that when I was a PhD student, and I loved it. It's about probability theory. I read it on a beach in Mexico. I'm a very normal person. It's actually a New York Times bestseller and worth reading. The other one, this is more for the people more in their 40s and 50s in the room, so a bit older for you, but sometimes worth reading these things early on, is it's called Strength to Strength by Arthur Brooks. That is by far the most powerful book I've ever read in my life. And I've reread it 3 times now. Yep, thanks.
So Monique, maybe we'll wrap it up here before we go into the Get a Bigger Wagon. Maybe just 2 comments to you. Number one, I'm delighted you can be in an exciting place without a map.
Yes.
I'm assembling an Edwards School of Business team for Canada's Amazing Race. So we need you. Thank you. And number two, seriously, the moment that captivated me in your presentation, your talk, was the day being fired and you're sitting crying in your vehicle or whatever. Have you ever gone back and thought, what if you never would have gone forward from that moment? What if that had been the defining moment of your life?
Yep.
Like, you think of the opportunities, the impact that you've had since then.
Absolutely. Actually, yeah, if I had taken that job, funny enough, I think even worse would have been if I hadn't gotten fired. If I had just left and started another job, I never would have known that those clients believed in me. I never would have known how much I had been building my reputation through that hard work. And I never would have ever considered entrepreneurship. So it actually ends up being one of the best things that's ever happened to me. And I've talked to many people from that old company now, and we have great memories we reminisce on. But yeah, it was pivotal.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.